Hi, in the next few minutes, we're going to talk about the main components of the API proxy. But before we dive into the anatomy of an API proxy, we need to understand where the proxies live within the platform. The platform is made of some core components. Organization, which provides logical separation for users, proxies, and data. Within the organization, we have the environments, which is the runtime execution context for the API proxies. Environments may contain a series of resources that are used by the proxy. For example, virtual host, target servers, cache resources, to name a few. Also, living at the organization level is the user management that comprises of users, roles, and their permissions. API products, companies, developers, and developer apps play a key aspect in the overall API management and is also stored at the organization. And because of this, keys and tokens are also stored within the organization. An API proxy is composed of three primary components. Proxy endpoint, which includes client-specific policies and configurations. Target endpoint, which includes target-specific policies and configurations. Resources, that includes custom extensions like Java, JavaScript, and many more. An API proxy usually has one proxy endpoint or one target endpoint. However, you can have more as well. Within these components, there are different entities which we will be covering shortly. Proxy endpoint contains the API proxy flows closest to the client. It has the following components: virtual host to define the incoming requests, flows to control and execute the policies, route rules to control which target the request gets routed to, and fault rules to define what happens when a policy fails or when the target returns an error. Let's take a look at this proxy endpoint example. The configuration uses certain tags and attributes to configure the various components we discussed earlier. Under the fault rules section, we define the policies for error handling. In the flow section, we can place different policies in the request or response path. HTTP proxy connection is used to define the virtual host and the base path that needs to be unique for every API proxy. Route rules is used to control the target request routes. A virtual host lets you host multiple domain names on a single server or group of servers. By defining virtual host, you can handle requests to multiple domains. A virtual host on Apigee Edge defines a protocol like HTTP or HTTPS along with a port and a host alias. The host alias is typically a DNS domain name. An environment can contain multiple virtual hosts, and a proxy is configured to listen on one or more virtual hosts in its proxy endpoint configuration. In this example, the OAuth proxy is configured to listen only on the HTTPS virtual host, whereas the customer proxy is configured on both HTTP and HTTPS. Policies are steps within the API flow. The proxy endpoint contains policies that affect the request and response to the client. The target endpoint contains policies that affect the request and response to the backend target server. Within the proxy endpoint and target endpoint, we have pre-flow, one or more conditional flows, post-flow, post-client flow. Pre-flow is useful when you need to make sure that certain code executes before anything else happens. Usually, security-related and rate-limiting policies are used within the pre-flow. Post-flow executes after conditional flow and pre-flow are executed. Mediation policies are normally used in post-flow. A conditional flow is a collection of policies within the API flow that all share one rule. Executes after the pre-flow and before the post-flow. The first flow, whose condition evaluates to be true, is executed. Post-client flow is used for logging messages after a response is returned to the client. This is a very specialized flow and only message logging policies can be attached to it. Apigee Edge enables you to monitor and modify API behavior without writing any code, that is, by using policies. Each step in the proxy implementation is a policy which is configured to perform a specific function. Apigee Edge out-of-the-box policies can be grouped into different functional categories, which we will be covering in detail later in this module. These policies can be placed in the request response path within the proxy endpoint and target endpoint. The route rule tag in a proxy endpoint definition determines the target of the API proxy and is evaluated after all policies in the pre-flow, conditional flow, and post-flow of the proxy endpoint are processed. A proxy endpoint can define the target as a direct URL, a single target endpoint, multiple target endpoints based on a condition, and null route. Target endpoint defines the way the API proxy interacts with your backend services. It has the following components: flows to control and execute policies similar to the proxy endpoint, load balancer that define one or more named target servers, and fault rules to define what happens when a policy fails or when the target returns an error. Let's take a look at the target endpoint example. The configuration uses certain tags and attributes to configure the various components similar to your proxy endpoint. Under the fault rule section, we define the policies for error handling, followed by the flows section where we can place different policies in the request or response path. Load balancer is used to control the request to multiple target servers. Like any other programming, exception handling is very important and plays a key aspect to anything designed and developed. An exception could be due to a technical reason like a network error with the backend system or something driven by business rules like incorrect payload or missing mandatory field. Exceptions in Apigee Edge is called faults, and Apigee Edge has configurations to catch these called the fault rules. A proxy can have multiple fault rules which are executed conditionally. When there are multiple such fault rules, the conditions are evaluated in the reverse order, that is, bottom up for proxy endpoint, whereas it evaluates top bottom in the target endpoint. Default fault rule is the catch-all fault rule which gets executed when no fault rule is executed. We will be covering fault rules later in detail. The HTTP target connection in the target endpoint and HTTP proxy connection in the proxy endpoint has a set of HTTP transport properties. You can use these properties to set transport level configurations. Some of the important properties are listed here. With this, I hope this session helps you understand the structure of an API proxy and its components. This is important as this is what will be packaged and deployed into Apigee Edge. For more information on this topic, refer to the documentation, and if you have any questions, please post them on our community. Thank you.